Ihr müsst hier leider räumen. Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank. Weil wir übergangslos zum letzten Panel, wenn auch nicht zum Finale der Konferenz kommen. Wir haben im Anschluss an dieses Podium noch eine kleine, aber feine Preisverleihung. Und es wäre schön, wenn Sie auch noch so lange an Bord blieben. May I ask if our online participants are already on board? Garry and Jan-Werner Müller? Can you hear me? Was?
Kasparov ist zugeschaltet.
Aber warum? Taucht auf dem Bildschirm auf? Müller ist jetzt auch drin. Okay. So, let's start. Ich würde gerne unsere Gäste, die hier im Saal sind, für die Abschlussdiskussion auf das Podium bitten. Natalia, Gavrilița, Christoph, Möllers, Katarzyna Kasia, please join me. And I will switch into English. Oh, please, free seating. Ladies maybe in the center. Yeah, Christoph Möllers to the flank. Natalia, good to see you. Before we jump in the final discussion of the day, and thanks to all who still are with us after a very long, at the same time stimulating and a little bit exhausting discussions, arguments, ideas. But I promise you the final panel will be worth to listen. We have some wonderful speakers. I start with our guests online. As far as I have to introduce them, because probably you are familiar with them. Garry Kasparov, famous as the former chess grandmaster and champion, but in the last years, I would say one of the most vocal, outspoken, clear voices of the Russian democratic opposition. A real advocate for liberty. Thanks for joining us, Garry. And online also from the United States, Jan-Werner Müller. He is the Roger William Straus Professor of Social Sciences at Princeton. So 9 hours time difference. And he's working mainly in democratic theory and the history of modern political thought. And you all know him as one of the most enlightening thinkers also in the debate on populism. So welcome, Jan-Werner Müller. So I will come now to the panelists here on place. To my next, Natalia Gavrilița. She is co-founder and director of Partnerships for New Economy, a new policy think tank focused on the European integration, EU integration of Moldova. And she also served as Moldova's prime minister from 2021 to 2023. We are very honored that you are with us. Next, Katarzyna Kasia. She is a philosopher and assistant professor at the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts in the Department of Visual Culture. And this year, she will host a new program on Poland's public broadcasting channel, TVP Info. And I'm very glad that you are with us, Katja. Last but not least, guess you know him as well, Christoph Möllers. He is professor of public law and jurisprudence at the Faculty of Law at the Humboldt University in Berlin, member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, a former judge of the Superior Administrative Court in Berlin, and I would say one of the most interesting voices in the debate between political theory on democracy and constitutional law. Welcome, Christoph. Over the day, we had a rich menu of thoughts and discussions about the meaning of liberalism, why liberalism lost track, and why liberal democracies are struggling almost all over the place. We don't want to repeat that in our final session. The overarching question is how to defend freedom, how to defend liberty against the challenges by more and more self-assertive acting authoritarian powers, and as well the anti-liberal rollback within the democratic West. But before addressing the how, asking how liberal democracies or how freedom should be defended successful, of course, the question itself assumes that there is the will to defend itself. Yeah, that we are recognizing that the West is under attack, what is at stake, and what is worthwhile to defend. And what is worrying me most is sometimes the impression that there is a lack of determination and even a lack of will of self-defense of the liberal democracies. Volodymyr Yarmolenko said today in the discussion, what we, the Ukrainians, are most afraid is that the West is losing faith in itself, that we are willing to give up. And that we have no longer a real sense what to fight for. So to make it short, it's a lack of sense of urgency, a lack of energy, and a lack of courage, which in my view today is characterizing most of the liberal democracies. And I would like to ask, how comes? And how can we overcome this state of defense, this mental state of defense, and then we should talk about what to do. I would like to start with Garry Kasparov, who has a very interesting perspective as a former Soviet dissident and now an active observer of Western democracy in the US. Garry, would you like to start?
Ralf, thank you very much for having me and for giving me a chance to start this very important, distinguished panel. You used the word defense. I would probably say indifference, because what we could see is just it's a lack of, as you said, lack of will to fight, but it's probably based on wrong evaluation. So for too long, people in America and Western Europe, the free world, lived in comfort without any threats. And, 3 and more decades after the collapse of, almost 3.5 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. And I'm one of the people, just probably few of us, who have been shouting for a long time about existential threat, not just from Putin, but from the rise of authoritarianism and inevitable influence of this rise and success of Putin, Xi Jinping, Erdogan, it's a long list, into liberal democracies. And now we could see it. We could see that it's Putin's lobbyists now very active. We have Orban, we have Fico. We're now facing the perspectives of far-right leader becoming a chancellor of Austria. So obviously, German election will bring the massive number of radicals from both right and left into Bundestag. So that's the result of us not recognizing the threat. And before we agree on our strategy, on the moves, we have to recognize the threat does exist. And of course, the Trump's return into power in America is another demonstration that we are now entering uncharted waters. And unless we can recognize the threat and decide to act, we are facing massive consequences of our passivity and our desire to live in comfort, avoiding tough choices.
Jan-Werner, observations. Jan, can you join us?
I can't hear Ralf Fücks anymore.
I just invited you to step in. What's your diagnosis and your we seem to have a problem with our online participants. You don't hear us? Huh?
Yeah. Here? No. No, I think he's muted, but that doesn't mean that he can.
Jan, are you muted? No. We are muted. We are muted. Technik, wir sind stumm geschaltet. Okay, now? Can you hear us now, Jan? Okay,
yes,
please,
yes.
Please go on.
So allow me to say two things. First of all, I think we somewhat old demophobic prejudice that somehow masses of people, the great unwashed, no longer care for freedom. I think the problem is much more, and we see this, unfortunately, right now in the United States, but we've also seen it in Europe for many, many years, that many people, especially elite actors, are willing to adapt, to make small adjustments, to try to basically go along with a new development, none of which individually will necessarily feel like a total betrayal of freedom. Every single step can feel like there's a justification for it. I'm often reminded these days of a film that maybe many of you know, Jean Renoir's great film, The Rules of the Game, which is basically, among other things, a film about the collapse, the moral collapse of the French Third Republic, where one of the characters, Octave, says the terrible thing in this world is that everybody has their reasons. So everybody has their reasons to adapt slowly to a situation where it's not going to feel necessarily like some tragic loss of freedom. But of course, all these small steps end up basically diminishing freedom, and they all send a signal to what we sometimes patronizingly call ordinary citizens in terms of what is acceptable and what is permissible. So if you think about the situation in the US, of course, Trumpists now say, look, he got this great mandate in the election. But for those of us who think he should never have been on the ballot, so-called ordinary citizens, of course, said, look, if he really was that bad and that dangerous, he wouldn't have been on the ballot. So surely all these elite actors, all the senators, all the Supreme Court justices who went along with this development basically validated this outcome. Remark number two, very briefly, and this I think goes along with something that Garry Kasparov just said. Once aspiring autocrats really are in power and entrench themselves in power, I think it's a real problem if then the other side, us, if I may say so, are always reactive. If we basically slip into a situation where they set the agenda, we are outraged, we complain, but we never sort of are proactive in any sense. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean to make a sort of trivial point about, the power of positive thinking and why don't we, sort of offer some super positive vision. That's obviously important. Liberal democracy is not exhausted by the fight against authoritarians and the far right. It has to have more to offer. But I'm thinking more about some ideas that, this might resonate with some of you on the panel that basically go back also to ideas of Eastern European, Central European dissidents in the 70s and 80s, in terms of not always sort of just talking back and reacting when it comes to autocrats, but to kind of build things in parallel and to basically build up a positive vision in something that can look more like a parallel polis, but that eventually, hopefully, will also attract other citizens. So not always to be entirely reactive, not always to remain in this kind of defensive crouch. Yes, it is important to talk about defending freedom, but there has to be more than defensiveness. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more. Defending democracy requires renewal of democracy, not only as a political system, but also the renewal of economic dynamics, of innovation. And a new spirit that we are in a global conflict between liberal democracies and authoritarian powers and have to invest more in our security. So, Natalia, what is your observation of the West, of Western Europe and the US from your perspective? And would you say that the spirit of liberty now is much more vivid in Central Eastern Europe?
I definitely can. Is this
on?
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here and to discuss at this important time very important questions. I definitely think there is more energy, more determination in Central and Eastern Europe now. And I think that we can contribute a lot to reviving this in Western liberal democracies. You know, I lately reflect a lot about this narrative to the people that democracy delivers. And I think we've gone a bit too far from democracy is worth fighting for. So in a sense, what we have done is brought up generations after generation of people for whom democracy has to deliver in order to allow it to be, rather than democracy is actually a system that allows you some individual freedoms, human rights, competition, rule of law, which actually provides a massive benefit. So we've also somehow sort of made it very transactional by sort of constantly saying that, you know, democracy has to demonstrate to people that, you know, people should let it be. I go back to what Mr. Yarmolenko said about being apologetic. I don't think we should be apologetic. I think we should, you know, very strongly say this is a better system. We haven't found anything better yet, where there is such a sort of good balance between, you know, the power of the state, the rule of the strongest, or the rule of the jungle, and individual freedoms and capability of people to realize their potential. So I think we should take pride in you know, this moral framework, if you wish. I think we should bring it back as a source of pride for our students, for our societies, for our politicians. So in what I have seen sort of in the political sphere, that this sort of need to demonstrate that democracy delivers has led mainstream parties around Europe to basically, also engage in this sort of transactional and materialistic game. But, we see Russia and China also delivers, and, they bring up generations who think that, actually this is not all there is. It's not just about the material things. It's about, you ask the Russian people, and, they have sort of impacts on the economy, impacts of the sanctions, and yet they are willing to actually go through this, so, and yet what we see in the West is that, we've had this period of constant growth. Yeah, maybe we're slowing down a little bit, but one, we apologize for it. Two, we think there's more and more and more that we should offer these young generations so that, they allow liberal democracy to be. And I think we should change this discourse and say, what are we willing to sacrifice to benefit from liberal democracy, to benefit from individual freedoms? And this, I think, will also allow mainstream parties to be less hypocritical and to start talking the truth. Because when they are trying to fight with the populists and moving more and more towards sort of populistic concepts, they sound inauthentical. And of course, people feel it and they vote for what is authentic. So, the mainstream parties say, oh, yes, we will ensure rapid growth and we will curb immigration. Under the current demographic situation, I don't think that's very realistic. So, why don't we start talking the truth to the people and say, what is it that we have to do to find an optimal rate that will allow us to maintain our way of life, but also, allow us, but also means that we will have to suffer maybe a decade of slow growth to maintain our values. So in my view, this balance between democracy delivers and democracy is worth fighting for has to be brought back from sort of the transactional and the materialistic to the more idealistic. Thank you.
Thank you. Katarzyna, I would like you to follow up. What do you think? What is the importance of, I would say, output legitimacy for democracies? So democracies have to deliver in terms of dealing with the problems, the challenges we are facing as society and individuals, and the love for freedom as an intrinsic value. But what are the sources for the love for freedom?
It's a beautiful philosophical question. Thank you so much for this question and for the possibility of being here. I was listening to all the panel discussions, and I'm really moved and I'm really happy that such things and conferences take place. I wanted to start from the story because, I don't know, a few months ago I had a privilege of hosting in Poland two very important people. It was Bassam Aramin and Rami El-Hanan. I don't know, maybe someone of you have read the book by Colm McCann called Apeirogon. Did anyone had Apeirogon in hands? It's a very beautiful book about those two men. One of them is Palestinian, second one is Jewish from Israel. And they are united in the society called Parents Circle. And this is maybe the only society like this that they don't want new members, because to join this organization, you have to lose the child in a war, in this war, in the Israeli-Palestinian war. And they both lost their daughters. Bassam's daughter was 8 years old, and Rami's daughter was 14. And they travel around the world to talk about peace and freedom. And Bassam, who's Palestinian, during our discussion, made a great remark which sort of stayed in me, and I don't know what to do with it since today, and I hope that in these very good circumstances we will maybe answer this question, because Bassam said, I don't want democracy. I don't believe Americans who say that they bring democracy to Palestine. We've never had this. We don't need it. This is not for us. This is not ours. This is not us, basically. And that's the first question I would like to ask. Is the search for freedom the same thing as search for democracy? Maybe this is some other way of thinking about the political systems that we can introduce, but we cannot impose. And that's what I've been thinking when I was coming here and thinking about what I would like to talk here. And the second thing, which is important, is that there are countries in the world who are fighting for democracy at the same time, who are bleeding for democracy like Ukraine right now, who are asking for democracy like Belarus, like Georgia. And Jarosław mentioned Georgia today and our lack of interest in democracy there. So maybe instead of bringing with our armed forces and American armed forces democracy to Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, we should maybe think about helping those countries who are begging for democracy and who are waiting for us to bring democracy and to help them with our forces. And of course, there is always a question why. Why the things like this happen. And the answers are horrible, are horrifying, are so bad that I don't want to trust that they are even possible. But this is the matter of the zones of interest and who is where, and in which global zone of interest you happen to be, your country happens to belong. And that's the huge problem here. And countries like Belarus, like Ukraine, like Georgia, they are just out of this zone of interest, which is interested in bringing democracy abroad. And you've been talking a lot about populism and about the threat of populism to liberal democracy, on democratic liberalism, as you put it. And of course that the populism is a threat, but it's also obvious that, you know, populists, as Vladimir Yarmolenko said today, is a very old idea. It is as old as the democracy itself. As you said, these were synonyms. And why the populism became such a threat in these days? Because it is well-funded. Because it gets funds from the people who want disruption in Europe, who want war, not peace, who don't want to support democracy, who don't want to support European Union, who don't want this union even to exist. So maybe we should think about the greatest threat, which is from Poland. It is not so far away. From Berlin, it is a little bit further, but still very, very close. And as Vladimir Yarmolenko today has said, you traveled 24 hours from Kiev to Berlin, and the flight from Warsaw took you only 1 hour and 10 minutes. And the other 23 hours, it is a very long time, but it is possible to travel. And I was also thinking about the term defense. We are talking about defending democracy. So it means that it is under attack. And we should really define who's attacking. And that these are not, you know, various populists in various countries, not connected. We know where the finances come from. We know that, and it's being said so many times. And I'd like to also say that in the morning, Karolina and Alan talked about liberalism using notions, very good notions like promise, hope, values. But I would add one more notion, which is courage. We need courage here. If we want to defend our freedom and democracy, we need more courage, because what we have to protect is beautiful, as you said, Natalia. It's beautiful, it's important, it's magnificent, it's one of the best human inventions ever made. But it's also super fragile. And under these serious threats, we have to protect this fragility with whole courage we have. Why? Because it's no longer only human problem. The earth is at stake. If we will not protect these values, which are in some very, very peculiar way entangled with thinking about earth, about ecology, about how to protect this also very fragile world we live in, we will be doomed, not only in discourse, but really. And I don't want to start talking about the migration in terms of climate change, but it is also very important. And we have to prepare ourselves. We have to
Katarzyna.
Make this democracy not only defended, but also open for those who want to come here.
Thanks a lot. Christoph, Möllers.
Yeah, I think I would a little bit endorse what Jan-Werner was starting with, and perhaps I start with a quote by an anti-liberal, because I always think liberals can learn a lot from anti-liberals, for example, strategy and code analysis. So Theodor W. Adorno, famous Marxist aestheticist and theorist, said once, "Nothing can be saved by being defended." And I think the very notion of defense is obviously an awkward one, and we should really think about if we want to talk in these terms, because they are defensive, literally. And I think we have to think about something more, as you said, proactive and positive here. I think there might be a difference in the political situation between maybe Eastern Europe and Western Europe on the one hand, and external pressure and internal pressure on the other hand. But when I look at Western European or Western societies that are somehow well threatened by authoritarianism, I would say basically the defense of institutions and the defense of freedom as such is not enough as a political project. The defense of institutions is good, it's important, but it doesn't mobilize anybody. And what we can basically see in the United States, as in Germany and many other countries, is there's a huge mobilization gap. Basically, we see people going on the streets, becoming active, spending their life with politics on the right, on the authoritarian. You can see, how many they read, how many they, what they do as, for them politics is part of their life. We also see that basically what we call liberals, people like you and me, don't invest so much time in that. I think we cannot really change that by goodwill, but the thing is that somehow liberalism has to defend a positive political project that goes beyond its own self-defense. Otherwise, I would think the prospects are rather bleak. This is true, as I said, for Western democracies. I'm not so sure, there is a huge difference to the case that you are under attack, obviously. Obviously, when you have to attack your freedom from an external force, when you are the Ukraine or so, obviously, then there is something like mobilization, there's a genuine political moment. But in a country like Germany, but also in a country like the UK, France, Spain, Italy, whatever, the United States, where you basically have a more or less functioning institutional setup, and you have a political, in a way, fight for the soul of democracy, the defense only will not help. Liberalism has to make better offer. than just to say, you know, we are the best order, believe us, we are morally valid, and please go for that because it's the best offer. There has to be something concrete, political, and I must say perhaps even more materialistic than idealistic, perhaps a little bit in contrast to the Prime Minister, with regard to the political offer. That is so difficult, and that may be my second and last point. This is so difficult because, in a way, democracy is both, or liberal democracy, liberalism is both under attack and in crisis. And I think it's important to somehow distinguish the two. It is under attack because, as we have heard, there are very many external forces and internal forces who want to finish it. But it's in crisis because much of its defenselessness is basically a product of its own politics. And as I'm a constitutional lawyer, let me just give one little example that is basically media oligarchy. So today in the United States, France, United Kingdom, Austria, and so on, the media is controlled by oligarchs. But these oligarchies have been created in the name of liberalism. And they don't even talk about neoliberalism. They don't even have been created in the name of deregulation only. They have also been created in the name of freedom of speech. So that we basically can say that liberalism didn't seem to have to offer a kind of coherent, politically informed, and somehow manageable concept of freedom of speech that protected basically media pluralism. Well, if you don't have media pluralism, well, you were one step further into an autocratic system, and that is what is actually happening. So this is not about soul searching. That is not only about self-criticism. That's in a way about a political analysis of where we are. And that in a certain way, we need a political strategy that goes far beyond, you know, the moral insights into the qualities of liberalism, that is somehow able to connect the defense of liberalism with something non-defensive, and something that is open to the things that went wrong because of a misunderstood way of political liberalism. Thank you very much.
Christoph, only a short question before we move on to other topics, because this issue already played a role in the previous discussion. When you are talking about the new media oligarchs and monopolizing of the public sphere by private media companies, for me, one of the uncomfortable questions is, we still have in Germany a solid pluralistic media landscape. Yeah, we have public broadcasting, the most extended and most expensive in the world. We have a lot of private media. There's still, I would not say there's a monopoly of press now with these social media platforms, but the uncomfortable question is, why seem they to be more attractive? And why do people no longer trust these established media with their journalistic standards, So before we think about regulating, I think we have to answer the questions, why do people, a lot of people see, for instance, Twitter and the other platform, on the other way around as the final media freedom, enabling them to take part in the public discussion.
Well, I think there's a very complex answer to that. I think there are, in a way, coalitions between politicians and oligarchs, in a way, that somehow create that. There is obviously an innovation cycle in which basically social media were, in a way, the kind of dirty, little, underfinanced thing that became more, because of that, more popular and so on. But then I also think that I'm not so sure about how this trust or distrust narrative actually built up. Because in a certain way, when you have a shitstorm, that is basically 1,000 people you cannot do anything with in representative politics. It's always an over-representation of people who are active in social media that somehow then makes politicians who actually have millions of backers feeling defensive compared to these thousands who are active on social media. So there's something going on that has to do, I think, a little bit with the lack of self-confidence of the order. You know, I would really like to trace down this kind of distrust narrative to its origins, and it might be just a made-up kind of distrust, which has now become true in a certain way, but which could have been protected by very simple rules of basically pluralism and antitrust law and so on and so forth. I mean, everybody is scratching his heads. So why is authoritarianism coming? And there are many complex reasons. But when you look at media regulation, things become rather simple.
Okay, Garry, whatever you want to say, I want you also to respond a question regarding a comment you made in the field of this conference. Yeah, you wrote, liberalism is under siege on many fronts, but there is one menace that puts the very future of liberal values at risk, and it comes from within our own camp. It's a lack of energy. And the example, of course, I would say the most telling example and the litmus test of the energy of liberal democracies is Ukraine. So what is your explanation for that lack of energy?
My disagreement with what just been said about lack of energy, protesting energy on the left or liberals. Actually, it's probably we can play with definitions. It's quite unfortunate that there was a lot of protest. There was a lot of energy channeled in the wrong direction. Trump's return to power is very much a result of defund the police, woke ideology, cancel culture, and of course, huge support for Hamas terrorists. I live on the Upper West Side in New York, 40 blocks north in Columbia University. We had campus supporting Palestinian terrorists, bandits, killers. And that's very much, shifted hesitant middle ground in America into Trump's camp. So that's a problem. Historically, we know that excesses on one side always help the other side, the radicals. And I wish, that we can separate ourselves from the excesses on the left as much as we are pointing at the right. The right actually is more beneficial because they gain this momentum, and many of the policies that are just not working are just, they gave them the momentum. So don't we understand that, the failed policy of Angela Merkel that brought, millions of Syrians into Germany? This was the beginning of the history of AfD. They didn't come out of the blue. So again, Trump was a result of the failed policies. The total ideological bankruptcy of the current Democratic Party made Trump possible. And as for the media, yes, but there was a distrust to so-called mainstream media, to legacy media. One of the reasons, COVID. So they suppressed all the news, all the stories about the lab origin of the COVID, which I believe, just was actually the case. I cannot prove it, but it had to be a debate. It was totally banned. And the result, people lost whatever trust they had. Now, Ukraine is it's another demonstration that the free world didn't understand a simple thing. We are at war simply because technology made this world much smaller. It's no longer possible to live, on two sides of the Iron Curtain without cross interference. And the other side, call them the bad actors, they know that. So that's why they are not trying to stay within their spheres of influence. They are attacking, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's Iran with its terrorist network, whether it's Maduro just spreading his criminal activities, selling drugs across America, whether Cuba supporting terrorism. They are not going just to stay within their limits anymore. And Ukraine is a test. Ukraine is one of the most important, actually the most important battleground of freedom. And we have to recognize it. As much as, by the way, Israel is fighting the same enemies. Are you surprised that you have the same supporters? So Iran, Russia, Hamas, Hezbollah, and you look at Ukraine that is bleeding now because the West simply doesn't want to recognize it, neither America nor Germany. We are at war. And the moment you say we're at war, we start acting like we're at war. We don't. The Export to Russia has been cut, but you see what's happening in the Central Asian countries. They are, you know, tenfold now, because again, the Western countries, even the countries that are most supportive of Ukraine, they still always fell short of stating we are at war with Russia, not because we want it, but because Putin is at war with us. Putin has been saying, it's not I'm trying to sell you the notion of the war, it's Putin. He's interfering everywhere. So the two most radical parties in Germany, they are just funded by Russia. We saw what's happening in Romania. We saw what's happening in Moldova. So it's either direct assault as against Ukraine, destroying the largest European country, or you know, supply with money and weapons through Iran to terrorists in the Middle East, or support of Maduro and other dictators in the world, or buying influence, whether it's Orban, Fico in Hungary and Slovakia, or Austria, Germany, and the long list France, supporting the forces that are disturbing the balance of our democracies. So unless we recognize we are at war and will help Ukraine, which is a spearhead of our forces now, we will be losing. Ukraine must win. And I didn't hear, maybe I missed it, but I didn't hear any Western politicians saying clearly, Ukraine must win. Not, you know, as long as it takes, there's no middle ground. In a war of ideology, as Putin launched on the free world, there are only two endings. Either Putin wins or we win, and that means regime change in Russia and full liberation of Ukraine. Before we state this goal very clearly, we'll be losing not only on Ukraine, tragically, but also around the world.
Thanks a lot, Jan-Werner Müller.
Disagree with Garry Kasparov's backlash narrative, which basically suggests that only the left has agency. They went too far, and then other people were simply reacting. If people really had been that concerned about woke, and that was their number one issue, whatever woke really is, I don't know what it is, they could have voted for Nikki Haley, and they would have gotten more or less what they wanted. They could have even voted for Ron DeSantis, and they could have gotten even more of what they wanted. But they voted for Trump, knowing who Trump was. And on a more empirical level, with the possible exception of Michigan, there's very little evidence. I mean, it's far too early to have any sort of grand theory of the election because empirically we know too little. But I think there's very little evidence that Hamas, Gaza, whatever we individually think about this, played any major role in the election. And I mean, this is totally anecdotal, but having canvassed in Pennsylvania, it didn't come up a single time in anybody's discussions. Inflation all the time, used to be better under Trump, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm not saying we have the answers, but I would just be very careful with basically saying, obviously we need to cut back on this and that, and then all will be well. Secondly, just briefly on what Ralf Fücks said about oligarchy. So I agree that it would be far too facile to simply say, we just need to automatically have more regulation about everything. But it's worth remembering what oligarchy really means. I mean, oligarch is not just a swear word for somebody extremely wealthy. It has a precise meaning in terms of basically converting one form of power or success into something else. It's not new. I mean, it happened in ancient democratic Athens. This is partly of what the much maligned institution of ostracism was about. It wasn't about ganging up against a popular person. It was basically saying, here's somebody who combines so many features of power that they're so dangerous for the polity that they have to leave. I mean, nothing else happened to them that was bad, but it's basically about that sort of accumulation of power in different spheres. We saw it in Europe already in the 90s. If you think back to Berlusconi and all the debates about, can this man convert his enormous economic power into media power and then eventually into political power? So this is not about saying to rich people, you're not allowed to speak freely anymore. Nobody has any problem with Elon Musk saying what he wants to say to the world. And I personally also think there's nothing wrong with him saying to Europeans whatever he wants to say. But it's a different thing to say I was successful in one area and I basically now want to acquire a platform, the way that, Bolloré in France, for instance, has acquired a platform on the basis of his economic power, which is then basically used to compound power more and more and more. And in a sense, it's a good thing that we can even have this discussion. I mean, 15 years ago in the United States, people would have, said to anybody using the old word, you must be some crazy communist. Now, as you saw last night, even the president doesn't hesitate to use this kind of language. But it's important, I think, forgive the very pedantic professorial remark, to be precise about, what is the issue. The issue is not that some people are extremely wealthy. That might be an issue, for a different debate about inequality. It's about power and the concentration of power. And the simple fact that certain concentrations of power are ipso facto, irrespective of the intentions of the individuals concerned, incompatible with democracy as such. And we've known this, since 500 BC, but somehow it seems we have to relearn that pretty important lesson.
I think we all agree that this is a new phenomenon, this unprecedented accumulation of financial power, media power, and political power, which now is unfolding before our eyes. And this is, I think we are still searching for the adequate wording. Yeah, is it a new kind of feudalism emerging? But I think we have to take this extremely serious as a threat to the fundamentals of liberal democracy. But I want to come back to the previous debate. Also, when I would not follow Garry in the details of his analysis, but also Alan Cahan this morning in his keynote, one of his key theses was that the rise of populism is very much about cultural alienation. Yeah, it's about a cultural conflict within Western societies. And my question would be, do you have any ideas how to overcome this cultural divide? This kind of cultural wars we are in. I think the answer cannot just be that one side has to defeat the other. Jan? The question was for you. But please. Obviously, Jan lost us, so Natalia, if you want to step in.
I'm not sure that it will be on your question precisely. I believe that the transactionalist and materialistic nature of sort of current systems and oligarchies and foreign powers intervening and trying to weaken liberal democracies, all of these factors have driven us away from public good and into discussions that affect a very small part of our society, but that are identity related and therefore present a lot of emotions which can be manipulated. So what I can add to this extraordinary discussion that I've heard is a little bit of a practical note. I can tell you that in my time in office, it was all about a myriad, thousands, hundreds of thousands of small decisions that involved deciding on a hierarchy of a moral claim or a trade-off. And everything that I've applied, I have learned in my university, in my school, in my family, in my society. And we have to get back to that. We have to get back to caring about what type of people we bring into our society. Because if we're gonna, keep sort of this churn of like, you will get more and more and more and more, I mean, you get to this extraordinary graph that I've seen Jan-Werner publish with a survey of, what you think is the minimum income you need to live, minimum level of income to lead a decent life. And then you look at the baby boomers, and it's under 100,000. 3 generations, before 2000s, is around 200,000. And then it goes immediately to 680 or something like that. So nowadays, what does it mean for our youth to lead a decent life? Does it mean having meaning or having $680,000 per year? And again, if I come back to decision-making, I really liked Mr. Müller's reference to limits. It's like pushing the limit, and it's a lot of minor decisions that push the limits. Well, let's collectively come with some solutions. What are the appropriate trade-offs? How do we break up the media oligarchy so that there is enough competition? That, by the way, is also a value of liberalism. So yes, freedom of speech, but yes, competition and ability for newcomers to come in. And then we have to take very seriously the role of disinformation. Because it's one thing what's happening in the reality, and it's a completely different thing, what people get on their social media algorithms. That's not reality. And we have talked earlier in panels about the virtue of truth. How do we, what are the solutions? And one of the sort of things I was missing as a decision maker, I could only rely on what I've learned or the values that have been created over time. But I had very few practical, real sort of proposals. How do you make these difficult trade-offs and still maintain the values of liberal democracy, the values that I think, I want my child to grow up with, the values that I think make the best societies that are possible.
Thanks a lot. That brings us back to Alan Gahan's plaidoyer for kind of value-driven liberalism, moral liberalism. Final remarks by Katarzyna and Christoph Möllers.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking about the values, but I can't stop thinking about what Garry Kasparov said about the war. And I think that it is the most important thing for us to realize that we are actually in this state of war. It might be more or less hybrid, it might be more or less expanded, but it is happening right now. And I think that, you were talking about the media and about, if I got it right, about the fact that there is still some sort of reason among people who can refuse these fake news and false propaganda that is present in social media and in normal media as well. But I wouldn't be that optimistic. And I think that we are sort of, that the war in the area of the information is also super important. And that what we say and how we say it and to whom we are talking, it is crucial. And I think that here the courage and responsibility is very important, because without this approach, we will never be capable of doing this about what Alan Gahan was talking this in the morning. I mean, about moral values, because we are losing the channels of information to transmit those values. So we have to regain them and talk to people as we only can.
Christoph Möllers, maybe among your final remarks, an answer to the question, how would you define what we call in Germany wehrhafte Demokratie? It's difficult to translate, kind of resilient democracy.
Militant is the word, actually.
A defense-ready democracy. Regarding this tension between liberty and to be not naive towards the enemies of liberty.
Well, it's not so difficult to translate it because actually the German expression is a translation. Because the notion is militant democracy, and it was invented by a German immigrant who wrote in English when he made that, and then it was retranslated into German. So it's a German who took an English word to define that. But let me just make 2 points, perhaps, one to your question and one other. But the problem with values and culture seems to me that you cannot produce them by means of politics. And if you try to produce them by means of politics, the order becomes illiberal. That is basically a value-producing order is, by definition, I think, not a liberal order. So you have to have values, but you cannot make them. And that means, for me, that you somehow need a positive idea of a political community that you somehow connect to the idea of liberalism, and that it is not enough to basically make a moral case for it. And that's very much, I think, what Eva was referring to when they talked about nationalism. I think the idea is that you have a positive concept of the community you will live in and sell that, if I may use that word here, to majorities, because otherwise, you know, all the moral and other cases for liberalism will just not prevail. You know, there will be just nice arguments. And that leads me to the notion of militant democracy. As you will know, we have a very robust institutional defense system in the German constitutional system for democracy. We have party prohibitions and association prohibition and so on and so forth. And I must say, I'm quite skeptical of them because, in a way, you can see that what do you do when you prohibit a party that has 30% in some states? You basically create a parliament that is not any longer representative. Not to talk about the people who are just you know, becoming, you know, illegal then. I think you have to be sharp, but I think the thing is not to prohibit political action. The thing is to be very to crack down on basic elements of the legitimate monopoly of power and you know, crime in a very basic manner. So basically, January the 6th in America was actually a crime. You know, it's not about, you know, defense of democracy. It was just illegal. The same is true for much of things that are going on in Eastern Germany, where basically liberal politicians are attacked on the streets. So if we don't have a legitimate monopoly of crime, we don't have to start to talk about constitutionalism, militant democracy, and so, because that is all add-ons we don't need. What we need is basically that legality is assured by a democratic police force. And that, I think, is how deep the crisis actually is, that we cannot really guarantee for that in many countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we exhausted the time for the final panel. And I have to insist that we come to close. Garry, some final remarks, very brief?
Yeah, I wish we had more time, because I'm sure, you know, we can have a productive conversation with Professor Müller. I disagreed with everything he said, because it's very clear that culture wars unfortunately paved the way for Trump's return to the White House. There are many facts, but we don't have time for that. First, you know, thank you very much for organizing the conference. And I think there's an agreement, with minor disagreements on some other things. There's an agreement in this panel that we are at critical juncture, because we're at war, and it's very important that the message goes through. So we have to fight back. I couldn't agree more. It was like music to my ears to hear the idea that defending is not a winning strategy. You know, you cannot win the war by being defensive. And we have to come up with a plan. And hopefully this conference will make a contribution for us to start designing the plan to fight back, whether the extremism comes from one side or another, and to, again, prove the simple fact, which is known for centuries. Democracy, liberal democracy, market economy, they are pillars of the successful society. But being under siege, being attacked, we have to fight back. And it's more complicated because the enemy is also within. Sorry for using this, the radical language, but clearly we see people within the European Union or American democracy that are not sharing these values, which makes our task more complicated, not as simple as a World War II or a Cold War, but it's, again, it's the history is just put on our shoulders, and I'll be more than happy to join with people on this distinguished panel, even despite some of our disagreements, to fight back for what we believe is paramount to preserve democracy and the future of the world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Garry. This was an almost perfect final word. And of course, liberal democracy is about different opinions and not only finding compromise, but getting more wise through controversial arguments and discussions. Thank you very much to all the speakers of this panel. Garry, Jan-Werner Müller, Natalia, Gavrilița, Christoph, Möllers, and Katarzyna Kasia. I'm not so bold to try a summary of the conference. It was an extremely, I would say, rich menu of deep thinking, of arguments, of ideas, also some political ideas, how to go on from there. And maybe I will end with bridging a seeming difference between liberal modesty, yes, liberal modesty and moderation, and the need for a more passionate, energetic liberalism and recovering the fighting spirit of liberalism, which was one of his original characteristics. I think this is the challenge we are facing now. In our following conferences and debates at the Center for Liberal Modernity, we will try to break this debate down to some political conclusions, what to do. But for today, I think it was quite a fine undertaking, and I thank you very much for being with us, taking part in the discussion, and of course, thank you again to our team which organized this event. But this is not the final act. We now have a small, fine ceremony, prize award for an essay competition on democracy and economy. And I would like to invite you to join us. We will, without a break, continue to this final event. Thank you very much. Darf ich denn die Beteiligten für